Get in, losers. We're going back to the 2000s to revisit the book that inspired the movie Mean Girls at a time when the concept of girls bullying different from boys seemed novel and revolutionary. Not your mother's Mean Girls, indeed. The year was 2004. I was at the end of 8th grade. It was track season. I was not a runner, but I did keep the track books. We were all hanging out on the field. Was it practice? Was it a meet? I honestly don't remember, but our friend Caitlin, one of 4 Caitlins in a graduating class of approximately 100 people, it was the 2000s, and they were all spelled differently. However, Caitlin was telling us about the recent movie she had just seen and retelling some of the iconic jokes and moments in the kind of whisper network virality of media before the internet really became what it is today. But iconic lines such as,
"Glen Coco? Fall for you, Glen Coco. You go, Glen Coco."
And
she doesn't even go here.
Would become part of not only the pop culture vernacular, but our vernacular through graduation. The movie, obviously Mean Girls, and while a quintessential comedy of my generation, most millennial women, and I assume women today as well, would tell you that it is tapping into something very real. And a dramaturg at heart, probably much longer than I even realized. I would have been the nerd that told you that the rules in Mean Girls for the plastics came straight out of the book Queen Bees and Wannabes by Rosalind Wieseman. And it was this book that I read even before Mean Girls debuted and came out around the same time as books like Odd Girl Out and Please Stop Laughing at Me that really tapped into a cultural moment about how girls socialized. And as a middle schooler at the time that these books and the movie Mean Girls came out, made me feel seen in a really important way. These books acknowledged all of the unspoken drama and angst of shifting friend groups in middle school and high school, and tapped into the idea of how a lot of the political machinations of teen girls worked. And because it so often moves silently and is part of a social construct that isn't explicitly named, at least until these books did, that felt like we couldn't speak it out loud, or I personally didn't have the words for it. And so it allowed these things that I was grappling with as an admittedly angsty preteen and teenager to feel vindicated in some way. I read all of these books, and we will save the psychoanalyzing of why I was reading what essentially were parenting books for another day. But again, it was that feeling seen. And since those books were published in 2002, 2003, things have only become more complicated for teens. So as we're revisiting Mean Girls with the release of the movie musical, I thought this would also be the perfect time to revisit and reread Queen Bees and Wannabes. Now, I was not able to get my hands on the original 2002 edition of the book, nor was I able to get my hands on what I presume would be the most updated version of the book, in that I got the 4th edition. Maybe that is the most up-to-date, maybe. And that was published in 2009, which is still my era of teen years. That would have been the year I graduated high school, but still is noticeably significantly different, especially in its exploration and expansion of the technology chapter, which, while feeling dated today, absolutely is still further evolved than when I was in middle school. And while the heartbreak of not being in the top 8 of someone you consider your best friend is strong, I obviously acknowledge that the added layers of technology and the way that school and real life and the internet all bleed together is exacerbated today. So I reread the book, and something that stuck out to me in this reread is just how much of a parenting book this really is, and also how kind of distanced I felt from a lot of it. While things like Mean Girls still feel very immediate and present, the kind of explorations in this book did feel a little bit surface level to me, and I couldn't tap in to as many of those immediate emotions. And I could still see the reflections of Mean Girls in this book, but with this updated edition, she has this thing where she will pull quotes from real teens and put those interspersed throughout the book to kind of bolster her points or explorations. But these have been updated with this edition. And so what I remembered most, as previously stated, was that in the first edition, she had collected all of these rules for cliques that she had encountered. And in Mean Girls, they took all of those rules and put them into one for the plastics. And so the movie is this really heightened exploration of the themes and ideas in the book. And so the book actually had a lot less social commentary and critique than I remembered, and I could have been remembering that more specifically with Odd Girl Out, which I didn't fully reread for this discussion. But it's also still undeniable with this edition that this is where the germs of the ideas from Mean Girls started, even if it's not always a perfect transposition. And before I dive into some of my more specific reactions, and I'm not going to get too specific, don't worry, I did want to kind of note some of my pauses while reading the book in relation to how we particularly talked about girls and consumption of media, and also how girls presented themselves in ways that felt borderline slut-shamey to me. And this is hard because, again, this is a parenting book, and there are behaviors that I do not condone for teens that are adult behaviors. But also looking back at this book having been published in 2009, remembering what that world was like. This was just at the end of like the Pink's Stupid Girls era. This was the reality TV era, which was also notated in the book. And so I'm not pretending that a lot of these behaviors that were being reflected for young teens are particularly or were particularly good for development. But I think that some of the framing and judgment in the language didn't fully unpack biases there. And I think overall the book was good at complicating ideas. I just found myself kind of balking and pushing back against some of these passages, and these kind of ideas were things that I highlighted the most. Also highlighting because I was reading on my phone, which is my least favorite way to read, but was the only way I could get it from the library. For instance, there was one passage that said, "Parents are often so happy to see their daughter reading a book instead of watching TV or texting that they don't read the books themselves and see what cultural values those books are imparting." And maybe it's just because we are in such a heightened climate of book banning right now. That in particular really struck me wrong. And that's not to say I think that parents being engaged in the media their kids are consuming allows for opportunities for conversation and connection. And keep in mind, I am not a parent, and I don't have any close adolescents in my world right now. But I just felt like there was a tinge of fear-mongering there, especially trying to think back to the books that were popular in 2009. Like maybe it's a commentary on being more actively engaged with conversations around the Hunger Games and what the dystopian commentary is in that book. I don't know, but worth noting. And so there were some of these comments that kind of permeated. There was like an offhand comment about how dads would rather do anything than read a parenting book that felt like it was putting the onus on mothers in a way where fathers should be just as actively engaged in parenting, and especially because fathers maybe weren't socialized in the way that is familiar in this book and is calling out these social structures for teen girls. They would want to familiarize themselves with this world, especially as this book really is a primer and kind of, as I said, presenting archetypes. And these archetypes are going to be incredibly important, especially in relation to thinking about Mean Girls, because one of the main kind of theses of the book is presenting the kind of social structure of a typical popular, especially clique. And this social structure, of course, has your queen bee, which we will discuss in relation to Regina George, as well as your sidekick, your banker, your messenger, your pleaser/wannabe, your torn bystander, your target, and your champion. And I think that Regina is the most static of this grouping in terms of her character archetype in Mean Girls and that kind of journey. I would argue that Gretchen is always the sidekick, but she might move through more of these or inhabit more of these groupings as well. She could also potentially be a banker and or messenger. Let me know your thoughts on that if you have firm ideas of what archetypes Gretchen inhabits. And then I think Katie embodies and moves through a bunch of these within the course of the narrative. Janice has embodied a bunch of these before we're dropped into the story. Karen is an enigma for me. She kind of is living, in my reading of the book, more in the fruit cup girl territory, which the author presents as a girl who is basically playing dumb for male attention and how that kind of complicates things. However, this is further complicated in Mean Girls, at least the original movie, because I have not watched the movie musical yet. I'm very excited about it, and I'm admittedly ashamed that I don't know more about the musical because one of my college friends was the OG Sexy Corn, and I am very proud of her. I have watched a lot of like the televised performances around the original Broadway run, and I definitely cried during the Macy's Thanksgiving Day Parade performance when I saw her performing. Neither here nor there. I also have not asked her any questions regarding dramaturgically how they approached this material for the adaptation. Basically, if they dove into these books at all in the rehearsal room, I definitely, if I was dramaturging this production, would have presented these books. I would have provided them as resources and further reading while kind of pulling out some of these main ideas for the cast. Because in my dramaturgical approach, though no one cares, I like to kind of have levels where actors can kind of get as much or as little information as they need or want, because different actors and their processes work differently. So some like just kind of like bare bones to kind of give them a sense of the world. Some really like to dive further into that research and have much more structure there. And as a dramaturg, while I clearly like research, I don't think either process is better than the other. Anyway, back to Fruit Cup Girl. So while Karen kind of embodies this, it's further complicated by the idea that she is kind of that dumb. However, we then have to kind of consider, at least in the 2004 Mean Girls, again, what era we were living in when this came out, and this idea of what was being reflected to girls as aspirational in media if we want to kind of live in that slight kind of uncomfy realm that is in the book in terms of what we should be showing and aspiring to, which I also do agree with on some points. Obviously, we want further complicated reflections in the media. It is kind of interesting though, because Katie in this movie is the everyman. She's the hero. She is the person that we are most likely, as just your average everyday girl, to kind of project ourselves onto, especially because, to quote the book directly, but my other reason for sharing this experience is that a lot of people love to see queen bees get brought down. And there is a catharsis to seeing Regina George taken down in the original Mean Girls. However, in the kind of cult classic status of this movie at this point, Regina George has kind of transcended and is this larger than life idea within pop culture as well. And so in some ways, she's kind of retained her queen bee Mean Girl status to the point where the marketing of the new movie is centered around Regina George, which you could argue and is true is the star power of Renee Rapp at the moment. However, that's also kind of in the casting and where you are placing that star power in some ways. Because in the original Mean Girls, Lindsay Lohan was an it girl, especially for teen girls. And so there was a little bit more buy-in for Katie's journey, not only because of her kind of like everyman hero's journey arc, but then because of the star power there as well. And so while we did get this breakdown of this kind of more stereotypical archetype, clique, friend group, I went into the book, like I said, kind of expecting more of this, more of looking at the kind of social climate and social structures of teen girls and the politics and dynamics of these groups, which are mostly reflected in the quotes in the book. What I found interesting is that there was a lot of kind of scripts in the book for how to deal with conflict. And while I recognize that scripts are very useful, especially in this time of development, I felt they were a little stilted and would be very interested to know if they've ever been practiced in actuality, and if they have been practiced, if they've ever been successful, because some of the ways that these scripts were advising teen girls to talk to their antagonists and confront their antagonists, while well-intentioned, I just don't know how successful they'll be, because while it did kind of talk about how unspoken a lot of these conflicts are, it didn't really delve further into the psychology of that and kind of the unwritten rules in some ways and how to navigate that. And so it was relying a lot on being able to confront these things, which absolutely, let's use our words, but not really fully exploring. It did touch on how girls have been kind of socialized to minimize our feelings or to avoid conflict in whatever way, and how that will then impact how these scripts work. Additionally with this, because again, this is primarily a parenting book, it presents this idea of like having contracts, both contracts for how you as a teen girl work within your family, how the family dynamic is respected, but also potentially friendship contracts, which again, I don't really see working outside of potentially a Mean Girl scenario. However, the family contract, at one point it talks about kind of solidifying it by having it signed in view of an authority figure of some nature. And I will give her this. She was very kind of inclusive of the potential authority figures outside of religious authority figures that she presented. However, she did suggest potentially signing it in front of a notary, and that just kind of baffled me. One, are you paying for the notary in this instance? Like, is that a little too far? Am I not thinking about parenting seriously enough because I am not a parent? And I recognize how tempestuous this time is and how important a book like this is for parents to have some form of action to kind of bridge the gap with their teens. And I'm really glad a book like this exists, because while I did read it as a teen, I am sure, though my memory is hazy, that I had access to it because my mom had first read it. And while she was reading it because she was also a middle school educator, and this was incredibly important to her line of work, she was surely also reading it because she had an angsty middle schooler. Also more like storytelling structurally, when thinking about Katie within this narrative being a new student, I think that is a perfect dramatic action impetus there, a perfect inciting incident, because the book talks about how new students are kind of a threat to the existing social order and how they can upset cliques. And so because Katie upsets the normal social order, it makes total sense that Regina George would be threatened in some way, whether she reflects that outwardly or not. And then we have the kind of changes going on. So it makes sense that this is Katie's story rather than maybe like Janice's revenge story with Janice at the center, because Katie is the impetus for this change. And then the dramatic action hinges on this want of seeing the queen bee brought down, as well as the success of the everyman that we have in Katie. But the kind of connections to the book don't end just with that group and the kind of dynamics of that group, which set out a really clear structure to play with in terms of dramatic action and kind of character types, so that you can then build the more developed character off that scaffolding. We also then have things like I'm a Cool Mom, which I would argue still lives in the cultural consciousness because it is this heightened version of an idea that resonates and is talked about in this book, with this idea of parents that are the cool parents or the looser parents and what that means for their kids. And so is even calling out the different parenting styles that enable specific behaviors and how that's reflected. And while kind of connecting to that and the relatable teen embarrassment of that, it also then is a commentary on this idea of popularity in the long term and how some of these kind of cliques and dynamics can continue on into adulthood for some people and what that looks like, which I find really interesting in relation to the idea of technology and teen girls today. Because while it isn't explored in this book specifically, because it was written in 2009, thinking about things like influencer culture and the way that cliques can kind of continue into online spaces, especially how that's surely heightened in young adults, I would be fascinated to read more about that specifically. And I'm sure that that is something that is being further tapped into and explored in this movie, because it is a movie for teens today, and so that would make sense. But as an adult reading this, it's not just the idea of cliques continuing on into adulthood that kind of interested me. Though there is some dulling of the content of this book, it doesn't feel as immediate or present for me as an adult. Clearly, there are still the echoes of similar social dynamics at play into certain adult spaces. But another piece that was in the book that I definitely think ties into today, especially with internet culture, is the idea of just joking and how someone will say something incredibly biting, searing, mean, and follow it up with just joking, or you can't take a joke when someone gets offended, to avoid accountability for their words. And I feel like this has only been exacerbated since this book was published and has become part of mainstream culture, so that people want to say the awful thing, but they don't want to face what saying the awful thing is actually saying. And I honestly wish we had gone into this even more in the book, because I think this is a symptom of this idea of this kind of conflict avoidant, passive-aggressive way of fighting as teen girls that this really is exploring. In addition to the cool mom, we also have the idea of teen girls and Halloween, and a direct quote from the book which reads, "Have you noticed girls will use any excuse to dress up in a sexy costume?" So we clearly have our Halloween party, which directly translates into the musical as the number sexy. And so kind of playing with this idea of how sexuality is explored and embodied for teen girls, how it's the fine line of walking between sexy and slutty, how that sometimes just comes down to who you've offended. There's also a chapter about partying in the book that kind of illuminates some of the dynamics of the party in the movie and some of those social tensions within that scene. And I think that all of this kind of underscores the unspoken dramatic action of the movie, in that if a lot of things go unspoken in terms of conflict for teen girls or are talked around, your dramatic action is not going to explicitly align always with the dialogue on the page. Your objective as an actor in the scene can vary based on your interpretation of the subtext. And while the idea of sexy on Halloween is heightened in the movie and the musical for that comedic effect, it's still exploring the idea of teen girls coming to terms with their bodies. Additionally, while we don't have, again, the rules of the plastics in this edition, we do have the idea of the map of the cafeteria and the kind of stark distinctions between social groups that is kind of par for the course in a teen comedy anymore, but is also directly pulled from this book in an exercise that Wiseman has students do in terms of kind of like mapping out their school and like what their school and the different social hierarchies and cliques at their school look like in terms of where they congregate and how they move about the school. And so again, while this book is a little broader, and when rereading it, I was like, what was the inspiration here? It reads a little drier than you would expect going in to inspire something like Mean Girls. However, I think it offers these kind of structures on which you can build these more compelling, dramatic moments. And in some ways, I think it's the perfect kind of jumping off point for the kind of yes and approach to comedy that Tina Fey has, because she was trained up via improv. And so you start with the kind of shape of the thing with, say, the Queen Bee and Regina George, and you keep yes-anding it, keep heightening it, keep going more extreme in a way that also illuminates things about teen girl culture that hadn't been spoken in quite this way before. And now because of that, in some ways, we have a Regina George that has transcended and lives in the popular consciousness. But even in the book itself, while we're exploring this idea of popularity and Mean Girls, it still does grapple with the idea that not all popular girls are mean, and that some popular people are popular because they're nice, because they're liked by their peers. And I think part of the lasting legacy for Mean Girls is due to the fact that we are pulling on these very familiar dynamics and forms of interaction within the teen years. And sometimes those cinematic movie moments transcend into real life. But if there's one thing that age and revisiting this book has made clear to me, is that I wasn't alone in middle school and high school. And in fact, a lot of my classmates were probably going through similar journeys of their own. So let me know what you think about Queen Bees and Wannabes as the impetus for Mean Girls. Have you read this book? Have you revisited this book? Are you planning on revisiting Mean Girls with this movie musical? Let me know what you're thinking. But as always, thank you for hanging out and listening to my thoughts. Like and subscribe if you feel like it. Read something good. And yeah,